Good evening, my friends, or good morning, depending on what time zone you're in. This is Paul, and how appropriate that I made a time-based pun for my next video, because I'm about to review Professor Layton and the Unwound Future for DS, which I just beat 2 days ago, or yesterday, again, depending on what time zone you're in, because it's like 1 in the morning as I film this. Anyway, oh my goodness, did that game have an incredible ending. But you're probably wondering if the rest of the game is worth it. So let me give you a bit of a background history about my playing experience with the Professor Layton series, as well as the gist of the series as a whole. So the first Layton game that I finished all the way through was Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright. Now I had known about Layton before then, because I had been a subscriber to Nintendo Power from 2007 to when they closed, God rest their soul. So I knew all about his games, and I said, yeah, cool concept, but it's really tough. Like, I tried playing Curious Village, and I could barely get past the cat chasing scene, which is like about 10-15 minutes into the game, to put that into perspective. But my best friend played all the games, and I was able to play the 3DS games because I figured, well, if they're anything like Versus, they ought to be kind of a cakewalk. They weren't. So anyway, my best friend played the ones on the DS, because he was more okay with the primitive technology than I was, and I said, well, I'm probably never going to play them, so go ahead and spoil it all for me. And so he told me the plots of all 4 of Layton's DS games, including Unwound Future. And of all the 4 games, Unwound Future really stood out as like, oh my gosh, this has like the best plot I've ever heard. This was before I played 999, by the way. And so before I even played the game, I googled the ending. And, oh man, it makes a grown man cry, put it that way. So then, after all these years, I finally decided to play it for myself. About time, Paul, get to the review. Yes, I know, critics. So, the gist of the Layton games is that Professor Layton is a professor of archaeology at Gresham University in London, but he also happens to like solving mysteries. So, of course, naturally, he wants to know the mystery behind why he's received a letter from his assistant 10 years in the future. And in the process of going to the meetup place, he finds that they actually have transported 10 years into future London. I won't go into further specifics there because it's a story-driven game, so of course telling you about the story would ruin your experience. But it's also a puzzle-driven one, and this should be no surprise to Layton fans, but this game is chock full with puzzles of every single kind imaginable. I'll spare you the details if you've already seen my Professor Layton vs. Phoenix Wright review, because it works pretty much the same as it does in that game. The difference here is that since it's on the DS, like, everything is on the bottom screen. So, as a result, the puzzles tend to have a lot more of a crammed feel to them because all the instructions are on top and the puzzle itself is on the bottom. Also, the touchscreen controls, for the most part, work pretty well, even if occasionally during the memo function, what I'm writing is always to the left of the stylus, which is kind of jarring. But overall, the puzzle selection works and controls well, except those odd puzzles that involve rotating the blocks. Those are even more of a pain than they were in Versus, and I thought that game was enough of a pain. The hint system, I found, definitely could have used some work, because I often found myself using at least 3 hint coins per math puzzle. I'm not exactly a huge fan of math, as you might have noticed. And I was even surprised by how much I used the super hint. Now, mind you, I tried my best to avoid those like the plague when I played Versus, and maybe only had to use it once or twice the whole time. But in this puzzle, it was like almost every other one needed it. And most of the puzzles, I still didn't get it. Even with the super hint, I eventually had to resort to just guessing near the latter part of the game. So I guess my main problem with the hint system in Layton is that, for one, they're not always clear, or they tell you stuff that you probably already knew. And because I played Versus first, I was spoiled by the fact that the hints in that game actually have pictures to go with them, making it a lot easier to follow along. But overall, there's still that satisfying oomph when you do solve a puzzle, hint or otherwise, because you feel like you're a total genius when you see that Layton victory pose, even if it's no longer animated, as it was in Versus. But enough comparisons to Versus. You're probably thinking, okay, Paul, this game came out as the third released Layton game, so how does it stack up to its predecessors? From what I've heard, one of the things they added was, of course, the super hint, because apparently the puzzles were really hard. Also, there's a lot more voice acting than there was in the first game. I don't know whether it was on par with the second game or not. And the animations are really incredible for DS standards. A few songs have live performances. There's a theme that you'll only get in the soundtrack, mind you, so make sure you get enough picker hats for that, which is basically just this super cool orchestra piece called the Unwound Future. And then the final credits piece has a whole bunch of instruments that are played live. And the rest of the soundtrack is a nice mixture of live and MIDI, unlike Versus and Layton's 3DS games where every song is performed live. The song selection is really good here. Like, even the ones that were in other games that I played sounded great, even on 3DS speakers. Because, yeah, I didn't go with the times. Sorry me. So, from a story perspective, I really don't want to say much, but suffice to say that there's this terminology that my sister and I have. We call it the Layton plot, where basically most of the Layton games kind of follow the same formula with like how they present their story. And in case you haven't played a Layton game, I really don't want to say it, but let's just say when you get to certain points of the game, you're just like, yep, typical Layton games, always gotta have that, and yeah, I should have seen this coming. But Unwound Future, even though it's kind of like that at first, boy does it throw a whopper at you near the end of the game, to the point where, like, no one was expecting it. And even the parts that you do, it's still fresh enough where it doesn't feel like a rehash. The game is still very emotionally powerful, explores some interesting ideas, and it doesn't feel like a forced narrative. Like, some of the Layton plots feel pretty far-fetched, and this one is too. But it's also, at the same time, believable, not only in the Layton universe, but in reality. It seems like a plausible, like, really good story in fiction, if not a plan that one could ever accomplish in one's lifetime, but still. So, what are some of the downsides to the game? I would definitely say that I don't really like reverting to the old-fashioned way of searching for hint coins. It was fun a couple of times, but all too often I'd try to tap on something and I'd get the professor and Luke just commenting on random things, and it would get in the way of me searching for the hint coins. Also, you could potentially bust your 3DS screen by tapping on it so much. I also was a little bit spoiled by the smooth navigation in Versus, so tapping from place to place, it wasn't as bad as I thought, because London is a relatively small town in this game. I also really enjoy the dialogue. Now, writing is sorry. The writing has never really been a high point of the mainstream Layton games, and this game is no exception. But the exception to the writing has always been the interactions between Layton and Luke and his main assistant. I especially love the jokes that are always being made about Layton's hat and the nature of his gentlemanly, like, overbearing nature. It never gets old, and this game just seems to have a nice, like, new dimension to it. In addition, this is the last Layton game chronologically. Like, even if you wanted to dare put Versus on a timetable, it takes place after the events of that game. So it's an astounding finale that should have been the last Layton game. But alas, it wasn't. And so that is probably the biggest flaw, is the order in which it was released. Maybe if it had been released after Last Spectre through Azran Legacy, I would have been okay with it. There wasn't really a need for a Layton prequel trilogy. In fact, if anything, that just made things worse. So, in my mind, if you're going to play Unwound Future, play it last. I don't care what order you play the rest of the games in, because Layton games typically do a pretty good job of having standalone stories, but play Unwound Future last. It has, like, that type of ending that's just like, this is the grand finale of the series. Kind of like if you were to read Cursed Child after reading Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows, you're like, I should have stopped at the 7th book. Basically, Unwound Future is the 7th book of the Layton series. Seriously. You can't go wrong with it. I would definitely recommend having an internet connection, though, as there are some pretty tough puzzles in there, but thankfully most of the hardest puzzles are optional, so you can bypass those if you wish. Anyway, I think that's all I'm going to say for now. There's probably more than enough reviews out there since the game's been out for 6 years, but from my own personal perspective, I would say it's definitely worth picking up if you're having trouble coping with loss, because pretty early on in the game, it's implied that a death took place. And the game does a magnificent job of, at least for me, helping me to deal with that when I had to deal with the death in late 2014. Anywho, thanks for listening to me rambling about another great hidden gem in the DS library. I ought to find more of those. And if there's any other video games you want me to review, let me know, provided that I've beaten the game. And until the next time, keep the faith, stay epic, and God bless. Bye.